Indians. He married an Indian. And his relations with the other powers, I don't like to use the word native, the other Indian powers at that time. Then my husband shifted to Baroda, and I had been working on French sources, on Francois Martin, etc. And when I went to Baroda, there was no source material. And at that moment, I decided to apply for a Homi Bhabha fellowship. And one of the biggest problems in medieval India has been why we never moved to capitalism. It's a big question. So I thought through my Bhabha fellowship, I would work on the textile trade and I would find the answer. But when I went to Baroda, there were too many other interesting things. There was a very live craft tradition. In the university, there was the archaeology department, and Professor R.N. Mehta had just found Champanir and was creating an interest in Champanir. And there was also the Baroda Faculty of Arts. So I got completely derailed. And my historian friends, I remember Ashin Dasgupta, I don't know if you've heard of him. He was one of our great scholars. He actually took time off to be with me. He was then at the National Library in Kolkata. He came and spent the night with us. And after dinner, Lotika, what are you doing? So I said, Ashin, I'm tired of working strictly according to a text. I translated the memoirs of Francois Martin. So I said, I want to do my own work. And I thought Ashin would not have anything more to do with me forever. After that, he left on his travels. And from different areas, I started getting letters asking me what kind of work I was doing. So Baroda was extremely influential for me. That is when also I interacted with people at NID. Ashok Chatterjee was looking after NID, and Helena, who was a Finnish lady, she was looking after textiles. And she suffered. She was very fair, and she could not go in bright light. But in spite of that, I think the person who knows the most about craft is Helena. And she built up all the craft documentation, which is now set in the course of NIFT as well. And then I started work on silk. And everybody talked about Chinese silk and Chinese weaving. So I felt that if I worked on the Paithani, I would get the answer both to silk as well as the kind of looms we had. Here, once again, I had to sacrifice all my theories. I found the whole project on silk extremely fascinating, and I worked on it for something like 7 years. And it took me to various parts of the country, except for Punjab. I think I've worked in most of the states. Then came the question that we are exporting textiles to all parts of the world. What about the looms of India, and how were these textiles distributed? By then I was a certified lunatic, and I went into the history of shipbuilding, of indigenous shipbuilding. So people naturally ask me, what are you doing? But that again was extremely interesting. I spent about 3 years working on Lakshadweep. And there was the link between Lakshadweep and Africa. And after doing this work, I started on another project, which was to look at the boats of Bengal and the craft of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So my book on Bengal has come out, but Andamans I still have to find a publisher. There I am, here I am.
Okay, thank you, Lotika. You have missed out such huge chunks. You haven't told us, so that's what you want to tell us now, is when you went into Kutch from NID, and before you started writing your book on Ajrak, what was the situation there? What did you see? Because now when we go there, it is so vibrant. I mean, literally when you go to visit anybody, from Jabbar to Ismail to anybody, you're actually in a queue. There are Koreans ahead of you, Japanese before them, Fab India ahead, and someone. But what was it like when you went?
When I went, there was Mamad Bhai in the village of Dhamatka in Kutch, and there was a river flowing through. And Mamad Bhai was the person who, the tradition of Ajrak is in Pakistan. It's not in India. But there were a few block printers who were doing it on the other side of Sindh, which is Gujarat. And Mamad Bhai started his work in Dhamatka village. He did Ajrak, bedspreads, and he also explained the different categories of the prints which went into Ajrak. Some were not really a part of Ajrak. And it was Mamad Bhai. He was a remarkable man. I remember once when we went to see him, and it was 12 o'clock, and I said, Mamad Bhai, do you need time off to do your prayers? He said, no. And he was a follower of Ahli Adish, which today is very strict. He said, no, Allah will understand. I've got my work to do. I will do my prayers later on. And what they used to do was to go from village to village with a pack of ajrak on their back and sell these. And it was very much a male dominance then. Ajrak was never worn by women. And in the business world, there was Mrinalini Sarabhai, who did a great deal, and the chairperson of Gurjari was then Brij Basin. So that is how all the things came together.
Yeah, it was, I think, a remarkable synergy at that time. When I hear stories that Mr. Bhasin tells us about how he met Muhammad Siddiqui. He was driving in his official car and he saw a man, as he said, with a guttery on his head. And he stopped him and said, "What do you have in here?" And that is how Ajrak became also what it did, because he sent in designers who put it into scarves and saris. And otherwise, if that car hadn't stopped, if Lotika hadn't gone, it would have been one more tradition that we would never have known about. Now, Lotika, kalamkari.
Now, how did I start on my journey? Oh yes, my kalamkari, that whole work was a product of my Homi Bhabha fellowship. I told you I wanted to find out about capitalism and I got derailed. Well, I got derailed because of kalamkari. I went to several European collections where kalamkari was exported, and I was always told about the European design. It is as if we in India had no thought in our heads and we copied everything from Europe. So, here are all my friends from TCRC. I'm sorry Olga didn't come, so I'm here instead.
I have to say I am actually delighted.
So, yes, so I was looking predominantly at the European tradition. They got kalamkari from here, and they used it basically as a drapery rather than for costume. Along the way, because I knew Father John Correa Afonso at St. Xavier's College, he drew me into the Portuguese network, the Indo-Portuguese. So I was looking at the trade in textiles from many different points of view. And one of the things which I wanted to do was to look at the Indian origin of kalamkari and then see what Europeans did about it. Indian origins were that the export market in the Arab world was extremely popular. We had Indonesia, we had Thailand also importing Indian textiles. And I think all of you have come across the word sarasa. Some people say that it was from Gujarati saras, which means beautiful. Indonesians say that it's a work in Bhasha, Indonesia, and it means variegated flowers. I've always been very interested in technique. And since I was interested in technique, I went into the batik tradition because kalamkari was imported. And I am absolutely convinced that in Indonesia, kalamkari was a cheap item. And those who could afford it would wear the Indonesian batik, which would have a rice paste resist. And even the chantung was a completely different form of applying resist. So we cannot claim that we gave our tradition to Indonesia. We did not. They had an independent tradition, and we also adopted some of the designs from Indonesia, like a temple border, which you see in some of our saris. That has both a technical answer as well as an art historical one. The temple border was introduced by Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, and the weavers who were weaving the ground fully of one color, and the borders, both warp and weft, of a different color, they created the temple border where the ground fiber had to interact with the border. But in Malaysia, they used to have it on their sarongs, and it used to be called the tumpal. And kalamkari had its origins in the region around Tanjavur. And there was a very rich tradition of kalamkari exports to Indonesia and to Thailand. In Indonesia, for instance, you have the island of Sulawesi. And Sulawesi, in the then known world, was the only place where you could get maize and cloves. Just as Kerala was the only place where you could get black pepper. So that is how I'm going all over the place, but you must bear with me. When you go to Kerala, you find a lot of depictions of Patan Patola. And even the prize that is given to the warriors, called Virali Pattu, that was a Patan Patola. Now it's made of many other fabrics. So it was through the trade in pepper that Patan Patola was introduced into Kerala. Kerala has no tradition of dyeing. It has a great tradition of fine cotton weaving. So, although you see Patan Patola particularly in Padmanabhan, the museum now, it was not something native to Gujarat. Similarly, from Tanjavur, they would export kalamkari and bring in some spices. And these spices, coming to the eastern coast of India, would find their way across the Palghat Pass into western India. So it is from western India that ships crossed the Arabian Sea and went to the Middle East. When you come to the Bay of Bengal, it's an extremely tempestuous sea. It's not a sea that you cross easily. So most of the merchants would buy products and go point to point exchanging. And the kalamkari that ended up in Indonesia was often not of very good quality. And you have in Sulawesi the people who make spices. They have a number of kalamkari pieces which they call ma cloth, and they use it as one of their treasures. And it has a ritual purpose as well. What else do I have to say?
Well, the next question, before we move away from the East, is can you tell us a little bit more about the Sarasa and the Saudagari trade with Thailand?
All right. We have positive evidence from about the 13th century onwards. But certainly trade existed even before that. But there's no concrete evidence. From Tanjavur, the court in... Thank you. The Thai kings they gave their own patterns which were copied, and like at a later stage with the Europeans, when they tried to copy the Thai designs, there was always something from India that went into these. And you have very beautiful textiles which are now in the Bangkok Museum. And it is not only in textiles. The kings of Ayutthaya also got ceramics in the same kind of pattern. So you've got textiles on the one hand, and you've got ceramics on the other. And it was at a much later stage, after Thailand became democratic, that the king gave up the monopoly over Sarasa, and Thailand went over to Western costume. And this is when the Gujarat people got into... yes. But the origin of Saudagari is in Tanjavur and Thailand.
So does your knowledge extend to Japan too?
To?
Japan? Where
a little bit, yes.
So, before we move away from the East.
Before we get to Japan, we have to talk a little bit about China. China had a great silk tradition. It had what is the artificial fiber? It's not like cotton. What is it called? Bast fiber. It had a great bast fiber tradition, but no cotton. And it was when the Europeans came in that China began to be exposed to the cotton tradition. Similarly, when the Europeans came, it was the Dutch who created a position for themselves in Japan. the Japanese had utter contempt for all the Europeans. So the English East India Company, the French East India Company, decided that they would not hold any transactions in Japan, but the Dutch East India Company had one small section where they could operate. They brought in Sarasa, and this Sarasa began to be used in some of the temples, particularly in decoration of the cart. But it never entered into the area of costume.
So before we move away, who were your influences during this time? Who were the remarkable craftspeople you met, interesting people? What are your memories of them?
I met several people in Tamil Nadu, but I can't remember their names now. People in Masulipatam, people in Gujarat, but the name I remember is Muhammad Bhai. And I met people in Indonesia doing batik. People in Japan who did indigo work, but with the Japanese dye. But I can't remember individuals.
So what are your memories of Kamla Devi?
Kamla Devi was a remarkable woman. I met Kamla Devi very late in life. When we came to Delhi in 1980s, I think we came. And Kamla Devi already then was not too well. She used to have a room in India International Center, and she would only go home at night. She took a lot of interest in me. We talked about textiles. And I remember a particular position which she used to sit when in the auditorium, from where you could get a very good view of... I think I had more to do with Pupul Jaikar than with Kamla Devi. Pupul Jaikar, you want to know?
Yeah.
Pupul Jaikar I met when she came to Gujarat. She used to come for meetings at the National Institute of Design. And then in Delhi, she created the Festivals of India, and it was quite remarkable. She had one little room in a bungalow in Delhi, and she had three people. One was the person who helped with her papers, then there was Mapu, and there was Rajiv Sethi. And with this skeleton staff, she created the Weaver Services Center. Kamla Devi had set up the design centers. Pupulben set up the Weaver Services Center, and one of the people who worked in the Weaver Services Center was the great artist Subramaniam. He was for several years, he worked in the Weaver Services Center. And there was another person in Banaras, Supakar. He was very remarkable. What was your question?
What was your connection with her? What work did you do? What were your impressions?
With Pupul Jaikar.
Yeah.
Pupul Jayakar really drew me into the institutions which were happening at that time. She involved me very deeply in the craft museum. And it was shortly after the craft museum itself had been designed. So it was a very formative period, and the craft museum then is very different from what it is today. The rural huts that existed, the artisans who came in and interacted with the school children. It was the beginning of this process. And today, if you go to the craft museum, the first thing you do is to see the very high-class restaurant they have there. But at that moment, it was very clear that it was only the original craftsman in whom she was interested.
She was another remarkable woman.
And I'm desperately trying to get her biography written.
Well, you'd be interested to know that I met Radhika Jekar in Bombay a month and a half ago, and that's her daughter. And Radhika is trying to also get material together to write her mother's biography. So I will give you her phone number, and maybe you can...
No, I know Radhika. And she's been working on this for a long time. I found somebody else to work on the material. But he said that he would have to speak to Radhika first.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm trying to work it out. If it can be done.
Okay. After we move away from the East, now let's move towards your work with Portuguese, with Portugal, and what Premila was saying. Your work that you have done recently with, I think, was it Palestine or?
Oh.
Yeah.
That's a Tagore Fellowship.
Okay. And also your work with Goa and Portugal.
We used to have these Indo-Portuguese seminars once in every 2 or 3 years in different parts, once dominated by the Portuguese. And Portugal has a very rich collection of Muga and Tassar embroideries in their museums, because the Portuguese were the first among the Europeans to start trade in India. And the Portuguese are a remarkable people. The story of their coming to India is also something that should be noted. When they started out from Portugal, people believed in the fact that once you reach the equator, you'd fall off the edge of the world. The Portuguese devised a way. They used to have 3 ships. One ship, and they went around Africa, South Africa, moved across the Arabian Sea. And they were such good sail people that when they came to the Arabian Sea and they hired local navigators, the navigators knew the stars. The Portuguese knew the stars in the Mediterranean. But as they came down, once they crossed the equator, there were new stars. There was a new sky. Everything was new. And they continued and continued and continued and meticulously recorded whatever they found. And all this material was available in Portugal, but there was an earthquake somewhere about 1935. All that material is gone.
Oh my God.
But the Portuguese, when they came to India, they went to Cochin, to a Hindu temple, and they thought that they were looking at transformations of the Madonna in the beginning. The Portuguese, unlike the English and the Dutch, merged with the Indian population to a much greater degree. And they developed a group of people called the Cachados. These are people who married local women and were brought up in India, perhaps never returned to Portugal. So, because of their ability to mix without thinking they were great people, the Portuguese learned more about India than any other European, and some of what India may have been like at that moment was captured by the Portuguese chroniclers. And they even discussed, they were very puzzled why there were no hospitals in India. The hospital is an Islamic convention, not a Hindu one. So Ayurveda was something which the Portuguese took a lot of interest in. So while I'm talking about Ayurveda and the stars and etc., what I'm really trying to say is that the Indo-Portuguese culture was something very different. And that is why the embroidered coverlets, which you find in Portuguese museums, are unsurpassed in beauty. And many of them were made in Bengal, but we are not sure because it's very easy to import the muga and the tassar. So it's quite possible that several of the embroideries were done in Goa. And many of the themes were Christian, but they were all Indianized. There's a very beautiful depiction of Orpheus in one of their coverings. And then the Portuguese were not interested in kalamkari at all. They wanted to get into the spice trade. That is when they found that they had to use painted and printed cloth to get the spices from Indonesia. But for the home market, they had these extraordinary embroideries.
Well, I've asked so many questions, and I'm sure there are many questions people in the audience want to ask.
I would like to know the position of Sri Lanka in this trade of the ships are going from the western region, western states of India towards south, it must be crossing Sri Lanka, and then it is going to Southeast Asia, like.
After this question, Lotika will then talk about Palestine. So this is about Sri Lanka.
You see, if you look at Sri Lanka, the only way in which you could sail, you could not sail round Sri Lanka. Not for India anyway, because then you had to go right down to the roaring 40s and then go.
Just stand up and speak a little louder, because it can't be heard here. Just come here and just speak a little louder. Yeah. Yeah, now.
When I was studying some Jataka stories, I found that it is something Bharuch. From Bharuch, the ships were going downwards towards the
Brigukacha.
Yeah, and it is going touching Sri Lanka, and by Sri Lanka it is going to Indonesia and even the Thailand. But I was amazed to see that those people who are saying that there must be a trade route going via Bengal, Bay of Bengal, but the Bay of Bengal, I suspected that those ships must be the volume of those ships must be very small, because those stories I found very little mention. There is almost no mention like river route following those two such long, because everywhere it is going by land and coming to towards Gujarat and then going. So there must be, and even I was in Sri Lanka and I found the ancient clocks of Sri Lanka, and those are very magnificent also. So wanted to know that the position of the Sri Lanka, what it played in, and even as a independent empire.
Okay, Lotika.
Now, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, as far as Gujarat is concerned, there is the story of Suparaka, the blind pilot, who took ships to Indonesia right up to Timor because of the interest in yellow sandalwood. We had red sandalwood in India, which was a medicinal thing, but yellow sandalwood with the fragrance we got from Indonesia. So, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned and the Bay of Bengal is concerned, we have to remember that the Bay of Bengal is extremely turbulent. And once you go to Indonesia, you have a lot of unevenness in the sea. And you have to sail very carefully and hire local pilots who know the area. So, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, we know that the Pallavas and the Cholas, they had conquered a part of Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka was not very important for trade. It had the elephant trade with Thailand, but textile, no. They didn't have a great tradition of textiles.
So before we open the floor for more questions, will you fill in the bit about Palestine also?
Then at the end of my career, I got the Tagore Fellowship And I had heard earlier that some of the patkas used to be exported to Denmark and Scandinavia, more particularly to Poland. So I wanted to find out more about this particular item. Why were patkas important in Poland? This took me to Jerusalem, and I wanted to go to Amman, where they have a very important museum, but for some reason I could not go. Israel was a revelation because one came across a civilization which has not touched our scholarship. The incense trade, for instance, the Nabatean trade in incense was extremely valuable in the earlier period. And that was the wealth of the Nabateans. And when you see the sculpture, you see a lot of Eastern influences in the early sculpture as well. And I spent some time in Poland, and I found that the costume of Eastern Europe was very distinct from Western. Western Europe has gone into the pants, trousers, that tradition. But in Eastern Europe, they were still wearing the garments which were popular under the Ottomans. So that is the link between India and the Middle East. Because very often you find people not wearing a hat but with a kind of turban.
Interesting.
So this is one aspect which we have not really gone into, which we should do.
Yeah, I think that is what worries everybody. There is so much unexplored. Like what you've talked about, the incense and the scent trade. The Mughals were so known for their perfumes. And the fact that they were oil-based and not alcohol-based, which is what you can only use in Islamic culture. You can't use an alcohol-based perfume. And you can only use oil-based perfumes. And we seem to have lost so many of these traditions without delving further or studying their histories. The floor is now open for any questions to Lotika.
No questions.
What has happened to the fair that you were having every 2 years of this Indo-Portuguese?
You said that you were every 2 years doing a seminar on the Indo-Portuguese trade. So she wants to know, are you still doing those seminars?
There was a seminar in Delhi at India International Center. That was in 2015. And the seminar papers, the transactions will be out soon. After that, there has been a lull and they are thinking of holding the next seminar in Madagascar. But the old thrust is no longer there. I remember one seminar was held for the bicentenary of Vasco da Gama. They had a major event in Bahia, in Brazil. And we were all told that you be careful, because there was a lot of resentment against the Portuguese for coming into Brazil. And the whole story of what they did to the Native Americans. But that was a supremely interesting seminar, because one got into Latin America and Mesoamerica before the Europeans came.
Sorry, can I ask you one more question? There has been a revival recently of what is called the Kunbi Sari in Goa.
Yes.
And people say, when they write about the revival, that the Portuguese were very keen on suppressing all weaving activity and the wearing of the sari. This is what I read in one or two publications that came out when the Kunbi Sari was revived. What do you have to say about that? Is that accurate or inaccurate?
It's very undecent for women to show their whole waist uncovered.
Yeah.
And certainly when you became a Christian, you had to do something to change the attire of women. So they wore a kind of burqa from head right down. Yes. And yes, it is true. They were against music. They were against the female style of costume.
Okay. So the few weavers who survived are to be lauded, and it's also to be lauded that the Kunbi Sari is back.
But the Kunbi Sari, I think, had its own market through.
Yeah, among the fisher folk. And
Yes,
others.
yes.
You also have to keep in mind that the adjacent area, the Kunbis are there in Uttar Kannada district of Karnataka, which is adjacent to Goa. They also wear similar, they also wear, there's a certain similarity, maybe minor differences. So we need to look at the market beyond Goa also. And we don't have that much of